I began talking to Viltrox about their upcoming 56mm F1.2 from their Pro series, one of the things that I was most interested in is the ability to do a head-to-head comparison with the excellent Fuji XF 56mm F1.2 WR. Because it has been rare that I have had lenses that are really so well matched in terms of their build, their features, their focal length, their maximum aperture, all of those things. So it just made sense that it was a very logical point of comparison. And so while I did do a review of the E-mount version of the lens first, I did want to review the X-mount version, which I've recently done, and also to do this comparison that I've done. Now, those of you that have been around for my channel for a while know that I've done lots of these head-to-head comparisons. Sometimes they're simple. There's one lens that is easily, in many ways, superior to the other. In some cases, it's tough because there's either a lot of give and take between the two lenses or they are just so similar. This comparison falls into that latter category, as while there are some areas that I can distinguish that I will emphasize as a part of this comparison, there is also far more areas where these lenses overlap and are very similar in their overall performance. And so at the end of the day, there's going to be some basic considerations that might decide this for you, but you're going to be surprised as we jump in today at just how much more is similar than actually is different. Sound interesting? Well, let's dive in and let's take a look. So let's start by talking about what is similar between the two lenses, and that list is surprisingly long. First of all, obviously they have the same focal length, 56mm, and the same maximum aperture of f1.2. And what's more, as is not always the case, I felt like the focal lengths behaved pretty much identically. They both seem to have whatever percentage they are in and around 56mm, seem to be pretty much identical. Both of them have a maximum aperture of f1.2, and again, I didn't feel like there was any real differences there, any variation. They both have at equal distances, they have about the same size of specular highlights. The aperture behaves pretty much similarly. They didn't always meter identically, but it was always within essentially a fraction of a stop difference. So they were very, very close in all of those ways. Both lenses have the exact same feature set. In this case, that comes down to having an aperture ring with 1/3 stop detents. Both of them have thorough degrees of weather sealing, starting with a gasket at the lens mount, internal seals, and coating on the front element, and so all similar there. I found that they had surprisingly similar levels of distortion, almost none, a -1 to correct the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion for both, and vignette, it was a +10 difference between the two of them, and so, a 1/3 of a stop at most, and so very, very similar. They both have roughly similar levels of longitudinal style chromatic aberration, and as you can see here, when it comes to fringing on my SLR test, they basically came out almost identical. They both have 11 aperture blades inside. They both have extremely similar rendering. And so, I mean, when I say extremely similar rendering, I have looked at dozens of comparisons at this point that I shot between the two of them, and I am really hard pressed to tell the difference between the two. And so they really are very, very close in a lot of these levels. And if you're interested in that, you can look at some of those same comparisons with me at the end of the video, and we will do a deep dive into that. So there are a few areas, however, where they do differentiate from each other, and so I'm going to delineate those for you right now. We'll start by taking a look at reasons to choose the Viltrox Pro lens over the Fuji. The big thing here, big takeaway, is price. The Viltrox is priced at $580 US, but you can get it even cheaper with a discount code that's in the description, whereas the Fuji lens retails for $1,200 US. And so that is a more than 50% price increase from the Viltrox to the Fuji lens. That's a big gap, and so worthy of consideration. You could get this lens and also the Pro Series 27mm f1.2 for the price of this lens. Now that could be a big consideration. This has the superior autofocus motor, and it definitely has the superior autofocus motor. It has got their Hyper VCM motor, which, I mean, at the least would be the equivalent of a Fuji branded linear motor, but this lens unfortunately does not have the linear motor. It has more of a micro type motor, and so as a byproduct, it is just, it's buzzier, it's rougher in operation. It's not a smooth autofocus motor motor, whereas this is a very smooth autofocus motor. And so that is one difference. And that actually leads to the next point of distinction and the next advantage for the Viltrox lens. The Viltrox lens is much nicer to manually focus. Because it has that superior autofocus motor, and because manual focus on mirrorless lenses is actually a simulation where the input from the focus ring routes through the focus motor to actually move focus, because you've got a smoother, more linear focus motor, it means that when you manually focus, you get a more linear experience. And so you can actually move along instead of like little stepping chunks, which is what you end up with the Fuji lens when you're manually focusing. It's not really all that fun to manually focus, because if you're trying to hit a very precise point, which happens at f1.2, you know, it's like it falls one side or the other, and you can't just like slowly just nail it into that perfect spot. So I definitely preferred manual focus on the Viltrox lens. I also felt like, in terms of my test charting in particular, that the sharpness was a little bit more consistent, that maybe in a few situations head-to-head, I felt like it had very, very, very slightly better micro contrast. Now, there was some give and take, and I did feel like, as you're going to see, that the Fuji lens, it was actually stronger on one side than the other. And so it was hard to get consistent results, because surprisingly, of these two, I would say if there's any centering variation, it's actually in my more expensive Fuji lens than it is in the Viltrox lens. But it's very, very minor, not enough that you'd really notice much in many situations. However, there was that little bit of variance there. I also felt like the final thing for the Viltrox is that up close, though they have the exact same level of magnification, another one of those similarities, they have the same minimum focus distance and the same maximum magnification, that maybe the Viltrox was just a hair higher contrast and a little bit better resolving up close. And part of that is because this does have floating elements inside, which does help with up close performance. And so you could see that it was just a little bit better up close in the at least wide open sharpness of up close results compared to the Fuji lens. But of course, there are some compelling reasons to choose the Fuji lens as well. Number one, it is smaller and lighter. It is 130 grams lighter, so that's significant. And then it is 16 millimeters shorter, which is also significant. And so if your goal is to, to get high-end image quality, but also to travel as light and compact as possible, well, the Fuji wins on that metric. I also note that while both of them have an aperture ring, the Fuji does have one feature here. It does have an iris lock that will allow you to either lock into the manual focus ring or out of the manual focus ring. So just one extra feature there that the Viltrox lens lacks. While I've already noted that the focus motor is not nearly as nice as what the Viltrox lens has, it's clear that the Fuji lens does have access to first-party focus algorithms in a way that the Viltrox lens does not. And so, for example, I found that while it's clear that the Viltrox lens is faster focusing, what I found is because on Fuji's autofocus is different. And so what I find on Fuji is that often there is the initial focus, kind of thrust moving forward or backward. And then there is a split second pause, and then there's almost like a double clutch where it then locks focus. Well, because of, I think, the focus algorithms, the Fuji lens, although it's slower on that initial thrust phase, it is faster in getting that final confirmation lock, whereas the Viltrox lens gets there faster and then it waits longer before you get that final lock from it. Likewise, when it comes to video work, it's pretty pathetic on both, by the way, and a lot of that has to do with the Fuji hardware at this point, but I'm not going to get into that rant at the moment. But you could tell from the focus algorithms that the Fuji lens is able to do more with less, whereas the Viltrox lens is doing less with more. With its better hardware, but it's on the software side, it's not quite as good. And so video AF, though it's rough in both these instances, it can be a little bit more confident on the Fuji lens than it is on the Viltrox lens. I also found that it had very slightly better bokeh geometry. And so what I mean by that is if you're looking at specular highlights, it's a little bit less deformation near the edges. And as you stop down by f2, it is pretty close to flawless, perfectly circular speckle highlights across the frame. There's still a little bit of clipping for the Viltrox lens at f2. It's not a major make or break kind of issue, but it does favor the Fuji lens a little bit. So as I mentioned, there are a few of these things that are big deals. A lot of them are very much a nuance kind of thing. And so that leads me to my conclusion, and that is that the performance of these lenses is so close in so many ways. If people are asking the question, which one has the better image quality? Well, the truth of the matter is that I don't think that either one of them has better image quality than the other. I think they have almost identically equal image quality. It doesn't mean that it's perfectly identical in every area of lining up, but it is so close as to be just not statistically relevant, any kind of difference between the two lenses. So I think it really boils down to two considerations, and one of those I'll just delineate for each lens. If size and weight are more of a priority for you than price, go with the first-party Fuji lens. It's a great lens. If price is more of a consideration than size or weight, then go with the Viltrox. You're going to get exceptional performance from each lens, and my hope is that future hardware improvements, namely better cameras with better autofocus in the future, it may have the potential to unlock a little bit more on the Viltrox, because the Viltrox, we know, has a great autofocus motor, because I saw it in the Sony E-mount version. The Fuji lens, I don't know how much potential it has to get better, because it will have its own hardware limitation, and that is its autofocus motor there. But as things stand right now, you get pretty equal performance in terms of autofocus speed, in terms of optical performance, and so there's very little nuances you'll have to go to. And of course, if price is a consideration, Viltrox all day long. But if you say, I mostly just want to keep the weight down as much as possible, but I want that f1.2 lens, then go Fuji. Decisions. Maybe it will help if you take a look at the deep dive with me. Maybe that'll make something come clear for you. Maybe it won't, but if you're interested, let's dive into that together. Okay, in this series of comparisons, I'm going to keep the Viltrox on the left, put the Fuji on the right. Here you have a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that both of them have just the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion. Both of them have some vignette in the corners, very slightly more for the Viltrox lens, about a +10 additional to correct for the vignette in the corners. So I reshot these optical comparisons multiple times to make sure I was getting accurate results, and so here we're looking at 200% magnification, and this is on 40 megapixels and XH2. You'll notice that in Lightroom it just designates as 56 f1.2 XF, whereas for the Fuji lens it's XF 56mm F1.2 WR, a little bit more specific. So we can see, looking in the middle of the frame, that the Viltrox lens has ever so slightly more detail and contrast. You look here at the writing, it's more crisply delineated on the Viltrox lens. Here in the mid frame, I also give an advantage, at least on this side, and I'll explain that in a moment. You can see, looking at this writing, it's clearly better on the Viltrox as opposed to the Fuji lens. Down here into the corner, the traditional places I look, you can see that definitely more detail is holding up until the end here. However, if we go over to the other side of the frame, it's now the Fuji that looks better. The Viltrox is about similar, but the Fuji's looking much stronger on this side. That's very obvious here, and even here it looks better. And up into this left corner, you can see that it also looks better. And so the Viltrox is actually a little bit more consistent in the performance, but the Fuji, it's very strong on the left side, less strong on the right side. So as we stop the lenses down, I feel like the contrast improves a little bit more on the Fuji lens than it does on the Viltrox. Now the center's looking very strong. Looking here, they are close. I still think that the text is a little bit clearer on the Viltrox lens, at least here on the right side, but Fuji's contrast is looking really, really good. Here on the left side, it's close, but I think there's an edge for the Fuji lens there. Looking down here, again, it's a little bit different, a little bit give and take between the two, but they're close. Looking over here, again, very, very close in that comparison in the upper left. Looking close, but with a little bit of a contrast boost, a little bit more detail for the Fuji lens. One more comparison at f2.8. By this point, they're both super, super sharp, and so you're getting close to maximum performance. They look very similar in the middle of the frame, not a lot to differentiate between the two. In the mid frame here, both looking really, really crisp, and I would say that, at least on this side, that as far as detail, I think the Viltrox wins. As far as contrast, I think that the Fuji actually wins. Moving over to this side, and now they're really, really close, and I would say it's kind of a wash there between the two of them. Looking down into this zone, also a wash, though again, I think just a hair more contrast for the Fuji lens, and over on this side, kind of a similar truth is what we've seen, similar pattern there. So both of them extremely sharp, but with some give and take, kind of depending on where you look in the frame. Now, both of these have basically identical levels of magnification, as you can see here. However, if we look in at the pixel level, 100% magnification, you can see that in the area where they're both in focus, that there's just more detail and contrast rendered at f1.2 on the Viltrox than what there is on the Fuji lens on the right. So definitely a win for the Viltrox there. So now we get into some of the comparisons where it's harder to draw conclusions. And so I could mix these up, and I doubt you would be able to tell the difference. The color signature is basically identical. The overall bokeh rendering, very, very similar. Even if I look in here on the point of focus, both of them are showing similar levels of micro contrast here. The out of focus highlights look very, very similar. It's remarkable how similar the two lenses look. Likewise, at this image, if you look at just the sum total of it, both of them have a similar swirl type effect at this distance near the edge, so producing really similar looking bokeh signature, out of focus region looking very similar. In this particular instance, the Viltrox delivered a little bit better micro contrast, but it could also be a matter, as I mentioned previously, the Viltrox is better to manual focus than what the Fuji lens is, and so it could be just a tiny little focus variation where I could focus that precisely with the Viltrox that I couldn't with the Fuji lens. And so again, it's kind of give and take on both. Another shot here, again, very complex scene, so a little bit harder to render, and yet both of them have rendered pretty much identically. And again, if you look just at the kind of contrast, micro contrast, I mean, they are very, very similar. I think the Viltrox has a really slight edge here, but again, if you didn't have them side by side and at 100%, you would not know the difference. Here's another image where I was just kind of surprised by how similar the two lenses looked. And so if I look at the area of focus and contrast, I mean, very similar. The colors are just almost identical from the lenses, which is really surprising. And then the defocused area looks very, very similar. I would say on this image, if I were to just do a blind test, I slightly prefer the rendering from the Fuji lens. I feel like it's just like a percentage or two smoother than what the Viltrox is, but you can see they're extraordinarily close. I thought I was going to get some great insights from this image of an apple. As you can see, I really, really don't. I mean, if I look at them, the amount of detail and contrast looks very similar. Saturation level is very slightly deeper from the Fuji lens, but it also metered just a little faster, so there's a tiny difference of exposure, and I think that that's really all that I'm seeing is just an exposure difference. This is another test that really surprised me, because if I looked in at the area of focus, I mean, they look very similar. I do think there's a bit better micro contrast, again, because we're up close here for the Viltrox lens. But as I looked at this, like the fringing out of focus area, I was just surprised, again, how similar they look. Almost identical levels of fringing. Perhaps a hair more on the Viltrox, but so similar in all of these areas that, again, if you didn't have them side by side, you would not know the difference. One final image here, the Fuji lens, it metered a little bit faster, and so, but it's actually probably very slightly underexposed. So I wouldn't say that was an advantageous. But as I'm looking mostly here at the out of focus area, and as I look at these kind of repeating lines up in this area, they just look very, very similar. And so again, I mean, my takeaway from this is that these two lenses, there are very tiny areas of differentiation, but I would not use optical performance as a metric for determining between them. They are as close to identical as what I've seen between two lenses before. So thanks for sticking around till the very end, and hopefully somewhere in that optical examination you saw something that gave you the clue that you're looking for. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.